Hello, Susan. Thanks so much for having me on your great program. I really appreciate it. It's an honor to be here. And thanks so much to all of you for tuning in to listen to me today. I'm going to talk a bit about the new normal. And as Susan said, I'm a consumer psychologist. I specialize in consumer research. I've been doing it for a lot of years, but of course, I've never worked in a period like we're going through now. It's a new situation for all of us. So we all have a lot to learn, but it's very important to get a handle to the extent that we can on how things are going among consumers, how we expect them to change, and so on. So it's really been fascinating to study consumer behavior in my career, but especially over the last 5 or 10 years, because there have been a tremendous amount of changes and upheavals in the marketplace. And this was going on even before the pandemic. So, one of the things I'm going to emphasize is that other than maybe Zoom happy hours and elbow bumps, the pandemic hasn't changed behaviors as much as it has facilitated or exacerbated trends or disruptions that were already going on. So, what happens in a crisis like this is that these things tend to move even faster than they did before. Now, first of all, I want to make it clear I don't have a crystal ball. I can't predict with 100% accuracy what's going to happen even in the next day, much less the next month or quarter. But frankly, anybody who does tell you that they can predict the future, if you believe them, then, I've got a bridge to sell you, or maybe some real estate in Florida, because nobody is able to predict with certainty what's going to happen, of course. But having said that, we can make some informed predictions or guesses, largely based on a very simple premise, which is that the single best way to predict future behavior is to look at past behavior. Again, it's not 100% because every situation is different, but it's helpful as a starting point to take a little look backwards and to see to identify some situations that at least have had some similarities in the past, and to get a sense of how people reacted there, at least as a starting point. And you've probably heard this famous quotation: "Those who can't remember the past are condemned to repeat it." And that's definitely true in marketing as well as in other parts of human activity. So, for starters, let's take a look back at the year 1918. Many of us didn't realize before the pandemic hit that we actually had a major flu epidemic or pandemic back in 1918 that killed many millions of people. I think we all know that now. And it's fascinating when you look back and you see some of the advertising and the public announcements and so on that were going on at that time, as these are all from 1918. You can see that there's a lot of similarity in terms of the way people are reacting, and especially using a mask and so on. For what it's worth, there's also some good data that show that cities that practice social distancing, that really enforce that, actually came out better economically in the long run for 5, 10 years, even longer after that, than did cities that did not enforce social distancing. So for what it's worth there. I've written about consumer behavior in the new normal. I write for Forbes, and some of what I'm going to talk about today you can find in a briefer form. If you're interested, you can just go to Forbes.com, look for my name, and you'll find this article. Obviously, there's a lot of interest among business people, among journalists, and among the everyday public, of course, about what we can expect in the new normal. So, as we think about this, how can we get our arms around a very complicated issue of predicting what consumer behavior will be like? I'd like to invite you to think about our society as a block of ice. Just indulge me. Think about our society as a block of ice that is frozen solid. And of course, what happens when water is frozen solid is it doesn't change its shape. And in the same way, consumers are a lot like that during so-called normal times. In other words, we tend to be very set in our ways to a very large degree, and it we tend to be, for example, reluctant to try new things. We don't like to really change our habits very much. When we have favorite brands, for example, we like to stick with those brands. We have set ways of doing things. We don't really like to change. Not to say that we never change, obviously, but if you're a startup brand, if you're a challenger brand, I think you can understand what I'm talking about. It can be kind of frustrating to get consumers to be motivated enough to really forsake the way they're doing things and to try something new. Now, every now and then, something happens. A big event occurs. Maybe you want to think about global warming, and that ice starts to melt. And the same thing happens here when we have a big event, a crisis like World War II, for example, or in this case, the pandemic. And so that ice starts to unfreeze. And as it unfreezes, in the same way, consumers are more receptive to doing things in different ways. The old ways of doing things, that's perhaps in some cases they can't do things the old way, like shaking hands, for example. And so they're willing to try new things. And that is a period where they tend to be more receptive to looking at new business models, new ways of obtaining products, new brands, and so on. So we're going to see some changes happen. And then eventually, just as with this pandemic, hopefully things will get back to pretty much the way they were before, and that ice will refreeze. Now, when it refreezes, it's solid again, but the shape is different. So what that means for us is that as we get back to our set way of doing things, some of those things will have changed. And what that means is that some of the behavior, some of the changes in brand preferences, et cetera, that are going on during the pandemic will now be frozen in place. What's the takeaway there? The important takeaway, if you're running a business, is that one silver lining to this pandemic, if we can think about it that way, is that this is an opportunity. This is a period where we're in an unfreezing time. People are more fluid, they're more receptive to doing things in different ways. And so that creates opportunities for businesses that are willing to try new things. And so again, it's overall, it's a very bad thing we're going through, but from a business perspective, a marketing perspective, there is a bit of a silver lining there, because we're going to see that some changes that were starting to percolate in the marketplace are really accelerating now as people unfreeze and are receptive to these new things. So I'm going to give you a quick book plug, just because I can, I guess. I actually, before the pandemic, right before I finished writing a book that will be out in February called The New Chameleons. And actually in this book, I talk about some of these fundamental disruptions in terms of how we think about consumer behavior. And I'm going to elaborate on some of those here in the time that I have left with you. So essentially what I'm saying is I'm shifting metaphors from ice to fire now, so you'll have to bear with me. But what the pandemic is doing is, for the most part, not causing changes, but rather throwing fuel on the fire. That is, there were things that were starting to happen or were on the verge of happening, and now they're going to happen much quicker. One example of that is the so-called retail apocalypse that everyone was talking about pre-pandemic. Of course, we're seeing that now on steroids, as major retailers from Neiman Marcus to J.C. Penney are either bankrupt or in serious trouble, and so on. Another example of that is automation in retail. So you may recall that in the last few years, there's been a lot of conversation about the role of robots and automation. Are they going to take people's jobs? There was a lot of pushback about that. Now we're seeing, as people are more interested, for example, in touchless checkout and so on, there's a lot more positive receptivity, I think, to the use of robots, because after all, robots don't catch the same kind of viruses that people do. So there's another example of how the pandemic has not caused a major disruption, but it's definitely adding fuel to the fire. Now, when we think about these broad changes in culture, one of the things that we observe, and if I can get a little academic on you for a moment, we talk about our culture being in a period of postmodernism. Now, that word means a lot of things to different people. If you know anything about art, if you're interested in architecture, you'll recognize that word. And one of the applications, and the one that I want to focus on, is that in a modernist period, we tend to like to put things in neat categories very scientifically. If you think about architecture, modernist buildings are the ones that are very symmetrical, like large skyscrapers that are, that are rectangular and so on. Whereas postmodern buildings are more fluid and they kind of defy categorization to some extent. And that's what I'm referring to when I talk about postmodernism in terms of consumer behavior. It's very important for us because, for one thing, it reminds us that the postmodern consumer, especially younger people, in terms of how they think about brands, their perspective is quite different. And by the way, they're pretty positive overall about brands. It's not that they don't like branding, but they use brands differently. They actively select different brands, some of them well-known brands, often some obscure brands, maybe some that they read about when they follow their fashion bloggers or what have you. But they proactively choose those brands that help to define who they are. And so branding plays a very important role in the postmodern marketplace. What that means for us is that in a postmodern period, we move beyond established industry categories. In every business, no matter what business you're in, your industry has categories, has ways to define both the products it makes and the consumers that it sells to. So if you're in the fashion business, for example, you might talk about resort wear or formal wear or various categories like that. I'm going to give you another example of that in a moment. In a postmodern period, a lot of those distinctions no longer make much sense because, from the consumer's point of view, they tend to blur together, and consumers want them to blur together. Very much like going to a restaurant, and well, I guess we don't have too many buffets anymore. But if you go to one of those big international buffets, and you can put lots of things on your plate, you're not having Mexican food or Italian food or Chinese food. You're putting all these different things together on your plate, and that's how consumers today really like to experience many of the things that they buy. So that actually creates a lot of opportunities for marketers who get it, for marketers who get that the opportunities lie not necessarily within those established categories, but between those categories. Because consumers are experimenting with a lot of different lifestyles. They're no longer hemmed into certain stereotypes. So this guy, for example, is, the typical button-down executive guy, but, here on his lunch hour, he's getting some ink on his arm. And so that's a very different lifestyle than the one that you would think he has by looking at his white shirt and his tie and so on. So let's take an example of this in the fashion business. That's a business that I do some work in. We have an established category, been around for many years, called athletic wear. And for a number of years, it's doing okay. It's not really doing great. Sales are kind of steady, nothing really happening there. We have another category the industry uses called leisure wear. Same thing for leisure wear, not much happening. But a few years ago, some smart people looked around and they looked at changes going on in the culture. They looked at some of the, for example, the emerging emphasis on wellness and health, and especially yoga as a lifestyle choice. And what did they do? They said, let's take some of the characteristics of each of these existing categories, but not be hemmed in by either of them. Let's merge those together to form a new hybrid category that we call athleisure. And as you are probably aware, athleisure as a category has really gone through the roof. And so retailers like Lululemon, for example, that was one of the originators of this style, they've done really well because they were able to look between the boxes and to invent an entirely new category. So what we want to do is we want to try to tear down the walls that separate these traditional walls, that separate consumers, that separate industries, and find new paths to resonance. Now, what do I mean by resonance? Resonance occurs when a brand really hits you. A brand is part of who you are. It helps to define your identity. It helps to define your culture. You can think of some of the obvious suspects there, like Apple and Nike, Lululemon, as I mentioned, Under Armour, and so on. Those are brands that have successfully figured out the story that they want to tell that goes well beyond functionality, because after all, a brand really is a story. And they figured out that the story that they're telling is one that people are really going to gravitate towards. And so it's going to resonate with them. So what I want to do in the time I have today, I'm going to very quickly go through 7 of these walls. I talk about even more in my book, but I want to quickly run through 7 of these walls. And I hope you can think about this for your own business. Some may be more relevant than others, but think about how you can break down established categories and assumptions to open up new opportunities. So the first one I want to discuss is me versus we. That is the individual versus society, and the individual's identity versus the identity that society wants to assign to that person. Now, back in the day, maybe back in my day, I guess you can tell from my gray hair, we had an expression, right? Do your own thing. And so one of the big priorities in society was to be an individualist. We could argue that we were actually conforming by all being individualists, but that the priority was on making your own decisions. Now, today, it's quite different, I think, especially among younger people, but not exclusively. When we look, for example, at social media, the enormous impact it has on our lives, one of the things is that people have a tendency to want to validate their choices with their networks. And so you've probably all seen, this thing that goes on maybe in a restaurant where a plate gets served to a person, but they can't take a bite before they take a picture and post it on Instagram. And that happens really quite frequently in a variety of areas where people are asking for input from their networks, not only after they buy, which we've always done, but before they buy as well. And so what used to be the era of me, maybe back in the 60s and early 70s, has become the era of we to a large extent. One of the things that happens there as a result is we have a tremendous explosion of what we call user-generated content. You may have heard that term. When people ask me what is the biggest development in marketing over the last decade or so, I usually say it is user-generated content, because what it means is that everyday consumers now are blending into the marketplace. And it's becoming very important to look at what other people are doing with your products, and consumers themselves are looking very carefully at what other people are doing with these brands, perhaps even before they buy them. Another outgrowth of this is the explosion in content marketing. So content marketing essentially means, rather than putting out a sales pitch and trying to persuade people to buy your product, you're putting out a lot of useful content that they're sharing. They may be contributing to that content, and then that generates interest in your brand. And so people are coming to you rather than you going to them. And that's, again, one of the dominant marketing stories of this decade. The second wall I want to talk about very quickly is the distinction we make between offline versus online. Now, most of us live in an online world, younger people especially, but even older people like me are constantly online. But I think for older people, we still have a distinction that we make. We say, I'm going online now to look at something. So there's a dichotomy. We're either online or we're offline. To a large extent, especially among younger people, that dichotomy no longer exists, because consumers today are both online and offline at the same time. They're constantly moving back and forth. and obviously spending a lot more time online than we've ever seen before. The average young consumer today spends more than 11 hours a day looking at a screen. So obviously, and omni-channel retailers and marketers understand this. If you want to reach these consumers, you still have to be offline, but you definitely have to be online. The point is that these, from the consumer's perspective, they're not making the distinction. So they're constantly moving back and forth. And that's where you need to be as well. So we have to look at ways to blend the online versus the offline worlds. And that creates also some interesting opportunities for marketers and advertisers when those old distinctions go away. So, for example, when we go into the digital realm, we see that technology is in many ways altering our perceptions of reality. I'm not talking about fake news here. I won't even go there. But for example, in terms of the types of images that we see in advertising, as you probably know, there's an enormous amount of post-production work that often goes on, especially in fashion advertising. So, for example, here we have a woman, a very attractive woman, a model, but she is not perfect enough to be in an ad, perhaps. So what's going to happen is that they're going to take her photo, but now they're going to doctor it in various ways. And so this is the image. The wrinkles are smoothed out. In some cases, body shapes and so on are literally modified, so that the image that we see online literally does not exist. Even though it's a picture of a person, of a man or a woman, it literally does not exist in the physical world. And that is something very important to keep in mind. We see this in cyberspace as well, as people increasingly are creating, for example, avatars, digital representations of themselves that they use to navigate all of these virtual worlds that are out there. Now, if you don't know what virtual worlds are, ask your kids, because they're spending many hours probably in these worlds. So, for example, here's a picture of a woman. You can kind of see her story. She's tired. She's got babies. Maybe she's in lockdown. I don't know. She's maybe struggling with her weight and so on. When she goes into cyberspace, when she creates her avatar to represent herself in virtual worlds, this is what she looks like. This is the avatar that she created. Nobody else created it for her. This is what she created. And you can see that it's very aspirational. It's based on how she wants to see herself rather than as she sees herself now. And so as consumers are spending more time in these places, their identities are changing in some very interesting ways that I've written quite a bit about in other places. Also, for example, there's a lot of digital fashion going on. A lot of young designers who don't have the capital to start a bricks and mortar store, for example, are going to post their designs online, very realistic looking. They might create a following there, and that might be how they launch their business. So there's a lot of activity going on in digital spaces, obviously. A lot of it's going on, by the way, beneath the radar. Many people, even marketers, are not aware of this, but there's a huge amount of activity going on in the digital world today. So we have to blend these two realities, the digital reality and the physical reality. One way that we're doing that, which is very exciting, I've worked in this area for quite a while, is augmented reality. You may have heard that term. If you haven't, you've probably heard of Pokemon Go. That was probably the first public, really big application of augmented reality, which means to augment it, to add to. What we're doing is we're taking the physical reality that we see with our eyes, and now we're taking our device, our phone or our other smart device, and when, for example, if you played Pokemon Go, you know that you could, go into the lobby of a building or a playground, and hold up your phone, and you're looking at that same lobby or playground, but now little monsters are running across it. Now that was a fun game. A lot of people got involved in that, but there's some very serious marketing ramifications to that, because what it means is if we do it the right way, we can take very static physical stimuli like store displays and billboards and things like that, and by holding our smart device over that, that can actually trigger something that's much more interesting. I'm going to play you a very quick clip. This was a project that I worked on with a company in Canada that creates this kind of technology. And what you're going to see is a demo for CoverGirl, where the package on a shelf, the boring package of a cosmetic on a shelf, now actually comes alive and is able to educate the consumer, for example, about how to use that product. So take a look at this, and you're also going to see a print catalog at the end come to life in the same way.
Casey, I would never go without my CoverGirl. I want to look natural. Simply ageless foundation to help you look. 3 easy, breezy, beautiful CoverGirl.
If the product disappears by the time you get there, don't worry. It means you probably don't need it, so don't add any extras here. Sponge.
So I hope you enjoyed that. Maybe it can give you a hint to think about your own business and how you might use that kind of technology there. A third wall, very quickly, is owning versus renting. This is very interesting because historically we talk about pride of ownership. We talk about the importance of owning a home, of owning a car, maybe even in the old days owning a record collection, and that's starting to come back among people who are getting back into vinyl. But the idea that you have a collection that you actually own and you're able to hold it and look at it and so on. And today that is really not very important, again, especially for younger people, as pride of ownership is no longer as important as getting access to things very quickly and being able to actually dispose of them. For example, a car, we were seeing a huge increase in number of people leasing cars. And in some cases, companies like Cadillac, for example, have programs that allow you to turn your car back in frequently, several times during a year even, so that you can experience new things. And so we're seeing an explosion in what we sometimes call collaborative consumption, where people are sharing various products. They're not necessarily taking ownership of them. It could be bicycles that they're renting. It could be, of course, Uber trips and that sort of thing. It can be music. It can be books. It can even be household tools, things like power drills and so on. It's much cheaper to rent a power drill for most of us only use that drill for probably an hour of its during our lives, and yet we're paying full price for it. So this notion that it's not necessary to own things, but now actually to lease them or rent them is becoming very important in a lot of industries. In fashion, for example, you're probably familiar with Rent the Runway and the phenomenal success that they've had, as a lot of young women in particular no longer think it's so important to have a closet full of clothes that they own but don't necessarily wear. Rather, they get a new outfit in the mail and then they're able to turn it around. A fourth wall, I'm going quickly through these walls, is producer versus consumer. So in the old days, there was a very, very thick wall, especially as companies didn't want customers to have any sense of what they were doing until the product was absolutely perfect and ready to go. That's really changed today. It started with software. We talk about things being in beta. And today, a lot of products are in beta as well, as some companies realize when they develop new products, the best source of inspiration for ideas is their customers. And so there's a lot of so-called co-creation going on where customers are enlisted to actually be involved in the production of the products that they buy. In terms of advertising, you may be familiar with the Doritos campaign that ran for 10 years during the Super Bowl, where everyday people shot ads for Doritos. In many cases, these ads cost them less than $100 to produce. They put them on during the Super Bowl, and for 10 years running, those ads were among the most effective and most recalled ads during the Super Bowl. So that's a great example, again, of user-generated content in the advertising space. Now, there is a downside to this. When you give the inmates the keys to the asylum, they're going to do some interesting things. And so consumers can be very creative. Companies that are used to guarding their collateral very carefully, their intellectual property, have to become much more flexible in this day and age. These are all examples of company logos that consumers have played with a little bit, I guess you might say. But the thing is that in today's user-generated world, the reality is you don't own your brand anymore. You co-own it with your customers. And they are going to find new uses for your brand no matter what you do that you probably hadn't thought of. I doubt that the person who designed this cigarette lighter, for example, ever thought that it would be used as a piece of jewelry for the face. But this is the kind of thing that happens all the time. So I say, get over it. In today's world, you have to be willing to share your IP with your customers, and there are some very tangible benefits to doing so. The fifth wall that is coming down very quickly is male versus female. We have a lot of conversations going on now in our culture and around the world about this traditional dichotomy, the assumption that you are either male versus female. And you'd have to be living under a rock to not understand that today there's a lot of change going on in these fundamental definitions of gender. The fashion industry certainly recognizes this. We're seeing an explosion in so-called androgynous fashion. We're seeing some prominent menswear and womenswear designers who are combining their shows, for example, and now showing menswear and womenswear together. There's a lot of upheaval going on in this industry that's directly related to the erosion of this wall that traditionally separates our definitions of male versus female. We're seeing transgender, a lot of discussion about transgender people and the role that they play in fashion, transgender models like this one woman who was a Brazilian woman who was on the cover of Elle, for example. Androgynous companies. So here we have Me Undies, a startup company. They don't sell men's underwear or women's underwear. They sell underwear, and both men and women buy that underwear. So it's a different way to think about things. Again, it also creates new market opportunities. So for example, it broadens some markets like perhaps jewelry for men, bags, accessories for men, that who wouldn't have considered wearing, for example, bracelets or necklaces before. Now suddenly there's a new market there because some people are thinking outside of that traditional box and finding new opportunities. The sixth wall, I'll mention briefly, flesh versus machine. So we have in our culture, we're talking a lot, as I said earlier, about automation, about robots. But we've always considered these robots to be separate from us. They're by definition not human. But of course, today, if you watch TV shows like Westworld, or there's a lot of conversation about robots. Do robots have rights? Just to say, do robot workers have rights like human workers have rights, etc. So it's fascinating to see, as this wall is coming down, how much technology is being incorporated into our bodies. So we know, this is one of my favorite images, but we know that the body is always a work in progress. And so we're always trying to modify our bodies. We literally don't look the same from day to day. This person, Mona Lisa, obviously looks quite different for various reasons, but we all, to some extent, are a different person today when we woke up than yesterday. But what's going on now that's different is that we're not just putting things on our body, we're putting things in our body, whether it's silicone implants or dental implants Many of us are walking around with pieces of metal in our bodies. Lots of people can't go through the airport metal detector because they have artificial hips and things like that. So a lot of products are really playing double duty now because they're multifunctional. So again, they're crossing industry boundaries. For example, smart contact lenses for diabetics that can monitor insulin levels is a great application of this. Pantyhose and I worked on this with a big company. Pantyhose that actually are a delivery system for various things. As basically what happens is that as the skin rubs against this particular kind of textile, it's called microencapsulation. It's got little beads in it that slowly open, and so as the skin rubs against it, the pantyhose is going to deliver, for example, vitamins or supplements and things like that. So we can today, when we allow ourselves to look between the lines, we can see that lots of products actually can be smart delivery systems. And increasingly, I think that we're going to see this as we talk about computer wearables and things like that. Lots of interesting things happening. In some cases, we're integrating advertising into our bodies as well. This is something going on in Japan. You wave at somebody and they see armpit advertising going on there. So this is a strategy that's sometimes called identity marketing, where the consumer actually becomes the billboard for the brand. It can be in the form of a temporary tattoo. Sometimes it's a permanent tattoo. But it really is an important development because it shows that we're not just wearing a company's T-shirt, for example. Our bodies themselves are emblazoned with all of these slogans. The final wall I want to talk about is one that's painfully obvious to many of us, and that's work versus home. So especially pre-pandemic, many of us made a distinction where we left our home, we went to a place called work, we did things there, we came home, we did other things. But again, before the pandemic, increasingly we saw that telecommuting was starting to grow in popularity. Obviously now, the boundaries between work versus play or work versus home are really blurred for a lot of people. Some people love it, some people hate it. Lots of interesting, kind of boundary problems crop up. Many of us have been on Zoom calls where we're interrupted by a child or by a pet or something like that. This was a famous one. You may remember this BBC broadcaster who suddenly had a toddler in the background there. Lots of industries are going to be affected by this. Home furnishings, how do we create home offices that allow us to get things done? Work from home fashions, Zoom shirts, some people perhaps not wearing pants. I hate to ask my students when I'm Zooming with them whether they're wearing pants or not. I kind of stay away from that. But yeah, it's creating huge changes, definitely in the fashion industry, but in some other industries as well. So I've quickly gone through 7 of these categories. As I've said, there are many more. I talk about them in my book, but hopefully you've been able to at least resonate with some of these categories, and I hope that it will maybe help you to think a little differently about your own business and opportunities that you can find. So I thank you very much for your attention. If you happen to be interested in getting a copy of the book, to pre-order it, it will be out in early February. Please just drop me an email, michael@michaelsolomon.com. I'll be happy to send you a link. And not only can you pre-order, you can get a 20% discount. So I'm going to stop there. Again, thanks for your attention. And I hope that we can have some questions and have a conversation about this. Thank you very much. And thank you again, Susan, for having me on.